Mm. Whatever is impossible is forbidden. Quote me on that. Whatever is impossible is forbidden. As we mature, as we grow older, we have to really discipline ourselves to only think in terms of the range of things that are possible. Now, I heard recently an interview with the renowned political philosopher Noam Chomsky. He is renowned, and I think of him as a complete imbecile. I have a very low opinion. And an interview was asking him very respectfully what he thinks of American drug policy. He's a very old man. He's lived through the rise and fall of several different sort of fads, both in terms of the drugs people are addicted to and fad beliefs, ideologies in how the American government responds to drug addiction. He said, how do you respond now? This is Noam Chomsky as a very elderly man to the rise of fentanyl, the rise of meth addiction, the current generation of the drug problem. And you know what Noam Chomsky said in reply? Noam Chomsky claimed that the single most effective way to overcome the drug addiction problem was simply to make people stop wanting the drugs. Was simply to address human desire, in my terms, human nature. Now, just fix human nature, just change human nature, just eliminate the demand for the drugs amongst drug addicts, but amongst the general population. If people in the United States of America just stop paying for the drugs, that solves the problem. Now, he said this fairly briefly. I mean, it's self-evidently absurd if you dwell on it or speak about it at any length. His real point was just to make a segue into expressing his disapproval of law enforcement to solve the problem, like policing within the United States, to further express his disapproval of border controls, of actually trying to stop drugs at the border, right? And then even further to express his disapproval of trying to eliminate the drugs at the source. So, for example, the American Army or the CIA or what have you going into Colombia and trying to actually eliminate the cocaine farms, the cocaine production, the cocaine exporting, try to eliminate it at the source, right? This he's very much morally opposed to. This he's very much politically opposed to. So then you can see how in his mind, this statement about how the real solution to the problem is just to fix what's wrong with the human heart, just to overcome what's wrong with nature. See what I mean? In a subtle way, our whole view of the world, our view of ourselves, our specific opinions about politics, like specific policy decisions we endorse or have an opinion on, they can all be shaped by a sort of reverie about impossible things. And part of being a mature adult is to instead sort of constrain yourself to reasoning about things that are possible, to think about human nature as it is, not as it should be, or in your fantasy, in your dream, as it could be. Now, what's the most effective way to reduce the murder rate? Why don't we ask Noam Chomsky? What would you like to do? You know, what we really need to do is speak to the sorrow of the human heart or human. What is this desire, this yearning, this something's wrong in human nature that if we can fix the problem that way, then there's no need for the brutality of law enforcement. So you can spin this out in different directions. Now, murder and drug addiction have something in common. They happen everywhere. Right? Like now, farming cocaine happens in a particular place at a particular time, at a particular farming coffee too, to be fair, right? But using cocaine, consuming cocaine, right? That's spread out. Some of it's visible, like it's visible on the streets. A lot of it's invisible. There are wealthy people in their condominiums who are using cocaine, and it's not so easy to go in and enforce the laws there, or even to give them a morality lecture or something to preach to them the virtues of sobriety. And a lot of us grow up with comic books or movies or TV shows that give us the misleading impression that all Batman has to do to stop crime is stand on a rooftop with his arms crossed in a sort of inspirational pose. All you need to do is look down at the street, look down at the alleyway from the godlike position of being in the sky. You know, when it's Superman, he's actually flying through the sky. When it's Spider-Man, he's swinging through the sky. When it's Batman, he's standing perched on the edge of a rooftop. And again, it takes a certain kind of maturity to realize you can't fight drug addiction that way. You can't fight murder that way. You certainly can't fight against a crime like burglary, home invasion that way, right? Burglary is happening kind of everywhere and nowhere. It's not located in one spot. Now, as futile as it might seem for the American government, or specifically the CIA, or specifically the Marine Corps, or anyone else, any other taxpayer-funded group, to go out and apply napalm to fields of cocaine in Colombia or any other cocaine-producing country. As futile as it might seem for the CIA or U.S. Marine Corps to cross the border from California to Mexico and destroy the factories where right now fentanyl is being produced, where methamphetamine is being produced, as futile as it might seem for literally the U.S. Navy to deploy submarines that are tracking the boats that come from China with the raw materials that are made into fentanyl, the raw materials that are made into meth, and the boats that are coming between, generally speaking, South America and Florida on the other coast that are bringing cocaine over. You know, as futile as that may seem to you, Noam Chomsky, if you're as shallow and petty as that may seem, as addressing yourself to the relatively profound problem of why is it people want to get high anyway? What if that is the difference you can make? What if that's the difference that is possible? And I would be the first one to say to you, if you manage to wipe out 100% of cocaine in the United States of America, if you manage to wipe out 100% of methamphetamine, if you manage to wipe out 100% of fentanyl, a certain number of people are still going to get high by huffing glue. A certain number of people are going to get high by eating shoe polish. I kid you not, people get addicted to that. It is true, a certain number of people are going to get addicted to something. They're going to get drunk or high or out of their minds. Somehow that's true, because what we can't fix and what we can't change is human nature. But what we can fix is the fentanyl crisis. What we can't fix is cocaine importing, cocaine farming, cocaine production. And right now in 2023, I think I am preaching to the converted. If you guys, it's a live chat audience, and if you can disagree with me right now, if you have been on the subway in New York City, if you have been on the subway in Los Angeles, California, if you have been living in the Pacific Northwest, if you've been living in Portland, Oregon, I think you will agree with me that if the biggest problem they had in Portland, Oregon was people addicted to huffing glue and eating shoe polish, that would be an unbelievable step forward in improvement and progress of humanity. That would be so much better than the situation we are in today. And it would be better in many different ways, including the fact that you would not have millions of dollars going into the pockets of heavily armed organized crime groups in Mexico. You wouldn't have millions of dollars going into organized crime groups and communist revolutionaries in Colombia, terrorist organizations. You wouldn't have millions of dollars crossing the ocean and going back to China, right? There's more than one kind of consequence here, right? And, yes, it would actually be better for the people who are addicted to fentanyl if fentanyl were hard to find. It would be, I know this sounds ridiculous, it would be better for them if fentanyl were really expensive and really scarce instead of being available at such a low price everywhere and so on and so forth. It would be better if the streets of Portland, Oregon, if the streets of Philadelphia, if the streets of New York City, if the streets of Los Angeles resembled the streets of Singapore, the streets of Osaka, Japan. I, I can pull on some cities I've lived in. We used to live right on the edge of one of the greatest drug producing centers in the world, the Golden Triangle of Myanmar. But we lived on the Chinese side of the border. We lived in a place called Dillong, China. Right across the border, there are organized terrorist groups that sell drugs in order to fund their civil war, whatever you want to say. They also sell illegal timber, illegal gemstones. But yes, those people both produce methamphetamine, and they grow, process, and traffic opium. That's all happening right there. And let me tell you something, in Dillong, China, there is no drug problem. There is no drug addiction problem whatsoever. Yes, if the streets of major American cities could reach the level of peace, order, and good government that is completely taken for granted in Japanese cities, or in the unique city of Singapore, or the cities of Taiwan, or what have you, that would be an unbelievable improvement for everyone, including the drug addicts themselves, including those who are that way inclined. I cannot say to you that life as a fentanyl addict is worth living. And if you don't know my circumstances, I see it every day. I see up close and personal the reality of what fentanyl addiction and methamphetamine addiction does to people every single day of my life. And yeah, I see it when I leave the house, but often enough, it comes right up to my window. It comes right up to my door. I mean, one of the most powerful, distorting delusions in the vegan movement can only be summarized in the following dialogue that I have heard from Hank Green, and that I have heard even more recently from Cosmic Skeptic and Peter Singer, as their conversation was summarized and analyzed on another channel that's called An Unrepentant Atheist. I'm going to refer to him as Stuart. He refers to himself as Stuart on the internet. That's not a secret name, but the YouTube channel is Unrepentant Atheist. He made a video summarizing this dialogue between Cosmic Skeptic and his greatest sponsor and supporter, someone who's been crucial to his success, Peter Singer. The dialogue, you'll see why I'm giving this as a dialogue, goes as follows. Eating meat is bad. We should all really cut down. But on the other hand, if meat is just going to go in the trash anyway, if it's going to go in the garbage, if it's just going to go to waste, then you might as well, And it's hilarious that two men with such haughty intellectual pretensions as Cosmic Skeptic and Peter Singer. Peter Singer is an old man, someone who's written about this and published about this for decades, are sitting there and they can't think their way out of this puzzle. On the contrary, they perceive this as something so real, so powerful, so unassailable, so unquestionable, that it is something like the Marxist belief in very easily refuted, very easily challenged assumptions or doctrines that Karl Marx set down with no empirical basis and with plenty of counterexamples in the world. I'm not going to digress here to give you an hour-long lecture on Marxism. We're not going to do critique of Marxism in this, but there are a lot of things where Karl Marx basically says X always happens. First X happens, then Y happens. This is what always happens. This is the great pattern of history. And it's very easily refutable. It's very easily challenged. It's a generalization that's not based in any deep understanding of politics or economics. And you can meet and talk to Marxists who have clung to that notion. They think it's a simple, irrefutable description of reality. In this same way, it's actually quite a complex, not empirically obvious assumptions that are based into this notion of waste. It would be a waste not to, right? but to them, it seems like the realest thing in the world. You know? Now, why did I say repeatedly, oh, this arrives in this kind of casual dialogue? In Hank Green's video that I'm alluding to here, he's just talking to himself, but it is in the same kind of casual dialogue format. Oh, well, on the one hand, people say this, on the other hand, people say that. I notice that they're reluctant to state it as a sort of Aristotelian syllogism. They're reluctant to state what it is they actually believe or claim, right? Like, is your claim that evil isn't evil if by not committing the evil act, the potential to enjoy or indulge in that evil act would go to waste? That is a proposition, if stated directly and clearly and honestly, that is so ridiculous. Nobody could take it seriously in any context with any set of examples. You guys may not have read a lot of literature from prior centuries. I've read a lot of stuff from the ancient world, medieval world, Renaissance world, from many different periods of history, from many different continents. I used to be a scholar of ancient Buddhism, so I've read a lot of literature from ancient India, ancient Southeast Asia, not just ancient China too. Right? People in the ancient world very often inherited a slave from someone else under strange circumstances. Very often. Very often you have someone writing that they personally disapprove of slavery, but they knew this particular slave. Let's say it was a kind of an older male, like a 50-year-old male. He was a nice guy, and he wasn't really young and strong enough to be worth much money anymore. And they knew, look, if I don't buy this slave and put him into my service to help me out, help out around the house, I know there's a much worse fate he can go to. The particular circumstance. People still to this day, they buy dogs this way. They buy a horse this way. They say, oh, if I don't buy this horse, it's going to be literally slaughtered and sent to a glue factory. It's going to be chopped up for meat. So it's better if I buy this horse and keep it as a pet, or I ride it or whatever. People do find themselves in these situations. People do end up taking over ownership of their slave from their brother-in-law and this kind of thing. There are people in the position of a hand-me-down slave, a second-hand slave. And they are literally in the position of saying, oh, well, I would not have enslaved this person myself. I think that's immoral. But in these particular circumstances, right? And again, we don't use these terms because it sounds so insulting to human life. But what they're saying in effect is, if I do not exploit this slave, if I do not become a slave owner who uses this slave, then their slavery will go to waste. If you are against slavery, you do not own, you do not use, you do not exploit slaves. Period. There's no ambiguity. There's no problem. There's no conflict within you that you feel you're letting something go to waste. That, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to have this person washing my dishes and raking up the leaves in my garden instead of the other work they're going to be doing for some other slave owner if I don't buy them, if I don't take on ownership of them. It absolutely, there's no conflict within you. All right? If you are vegan and you are at an office party, and this is an example for many times people who actually did it or actually lived it, and there is free pizza at the office party, and let's just say the pizza has both cheese and pepperoni on it, just probably a lot of you have been in a situation, you do not feel that there's some kind of moral obligation on you to eat the pizza so the pizza doesn't go to waste. I realize this is less shocking, to sensibilities in the 21st century than the prospect of becoming the owner and exploiter of a slave. But it shouldn't be. It's actually much less shocking to feel some compassion for a slave. And again, I've read about this in the ancient world all over the place. Very often, especially talking about an older male slave and nobody really wants them anymore. It's just the type of labor. When they're young and strong, people want them. You may really be in a position where you think, I can provide this man with a good home. I can kind of care for him, and he'll help me out a little bit around the house, around the farm. He'll help me raise my own children. He'll be like an uncle to my children. Very common with slavery. And I know this is the situation he's going to be in if I don't buy him into government. You may really sympathize with him, and he may beg you to do it. He may say, please, 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 give me a home, give me a place to live where I'm not being whipped and worked to death, where I can just help you raise your kids and watch. I'll be so thankful, please. And that's the slave is a human being making a rational choice. And of course, there can be a lot of other components to do. The slave may say to you, he had a child once, and his child was taken away from him when his wife and child were sold to another master. It would mean so much to him if he could help raise your child. There are all kinds of elements there that really tug at your heartstrings that aren't present with an animal that cannot speak in any language we understand, right? You may be really aware of and really certain of the fact that you are doing something good for another human being who affirms that to you, who thanks you, who is aware and understands from their own perspective of the good you're doing to them, and who is aware of how much worse their life would be if you hadn't enslaved them, paradoxically, right? And again, some percentage of people who become slaves in exactly this way actually do consent to their enslavement. In every slave society, some slaves actually sell themselves into slavery and feel it's a better deal for them than the other career paths. If you haven't done this kind of reading, this will seem shocking and strange to you. Some of you have a very simplified notion of what slavery is and how it worked historically. It's full of precisely these heartbreaking contradictions. What percentage of dairy cattle do you suppose in this way are really happy to be the products of forced insemination, to be created and brought into this world by human contrivance, to be separated from their mothers as soon as they're born, not be able to drink their own mother's breast milk, to be raised in a steel cage on a concrete floor, never seeing the sky, to be raped, to be impregnated again and again and again so they can produce as much milk as possible before they have their throats slit and their bodies consumed by human beings, or by dogs if they end up as dog food, or what have you. The nature of the exploitation is so extreme. There's no hypothetical cow that could consent to this, that could agree to this, even if their alternative was to wander foraging for grass in the forest until one day a pack of wolves pounced on the cow and devoured it. Like, if that's the life the cow can have in the wilderness for however many years it lasts, or for however many months before a predator in the wild eats them, this similar to a deer. If you imagine a deer living in the wild, there is no cow where, if we can magically grant this cow a human level of cognition and language, can look this over, we can give the cow a tour of the slaughterhouse and explain the whole process and say, yeah, I'm going to sign up for the steel cage and being hooked to a milking machine and the endless impregnation, the repetition of this, right? Now, I'm going to make a further claim here. Even if you lived in a world where 100% of slaves morally approved of slavery, slavery would still be wrong. It's still evil. Even if you lived in a world where 100% of cows had the level of cognition and language ability of a human being, and 100% of cows consented to this, they said, no, I don't want to forage for food in the wilderness. I don't want to live like a deer, and I don't want to be hunted eventually by wild bears or wild wolves or whatever it is. No. I'm going to sign up for the steel cage, being fed out of a trough, and then eventually have my throat slit. It would still be evil. It would still be wrong, even with the consent of the victim. Okay. I'm going to take a moment to read your comments. If anyone has anything intelligent to say, whether it be a question or a statement or an objection, Now is the time. I want to say this. I do not give a fuck if you give a thumbs up to this video or not. I do not give a fuck if you share this link with other people you know who would benefit from hearing this discussion. And I do not give a fuck if you pay $1 to support me on Patreon. If you pay $1.08 to get my book from Amazon, my book, Veganism, Future of an Illusion, that philosophizes further. Okay? The reality is there is no other YouTube channel on which you can hear a discussion of vegan political philosophy at this level. And there never has been. You can go and compare Gary Francione's YouTube channel. For the generations prior to me, I would say Gary Francione was the best whoever did it. He was a master of the art form. But I'm better than him. You can go to Gary Yourofsky's channel. I mean, once we get past the top two Garys, my competition gets really laughable. You can go to Earthling Ed's channel, go to Joey Carbstrong's channel. Who are the great intellectual lights? Who are the leaders of the vegan movement today? Most of them are pretty pathetic compared to Gary Francione. Okay? I do not give a fuck why it is there are 36 people in the audience right now, and I don't have 36 thumbs up. Maybe you can't appreciate this discussion. Maybe you don't appreciate what's happening here. Maybe you don't appreciate the opportunity that's there to buy my book or join my Patreon or to talk to me or ask me questions right now. The fact of the matter is, I am the best who ever fucking did this. And I hope one day there's someone better than me. But right now, if you think I'm a moron, if you think I'm a loser, if you think I'm not good enough for this, bad news. Because I'm the best you've got. It's me or James Aspie. It's me or Gary Yourofsky. Take your fucking pick. Just take a moment to read your comments. Someone from the audience, Lee Dooley. Welcome to the audience. I don't know this person. I don't remember you from another live stream. Lee Dooley comments, quote, I rode the commuter train daily in Denver, Colorado for about 4 years before COVID. I was always fine on there. Maybe you could have the scent of weed in the air or something like that, scent of marijuana. But nowadays, there are at least 4 or 5 zonked out people on fentanyl there daily. It's spooky. Right? Based on my research, which is not perfect, I do think that one of the big differences between the current fentanyl crisis and any prior drug crisis is just cost. The fentanyl is so concentrated, it's so efficient, and it's so cheap. Someone can be a total drug addict for just $5 a day on fentanyl. And that was not true of cocaine. It was not true of heroin. Now, of course, you could also be a drug addict spending $15 a day on fentanyl. You can build up your tolerance to that extent. But it's so efficient and it's so cheap, even compared to methamphetamine. And of course, when methamphetamine started being mass manufactured, people were shocked at how cheap that was. Now, again, this is the cost relative to the destructive potential in your life. And that's part of the phenomenon. It's also part of why there's so little robbery connected to fentanyl addiction specifically. So here in Canada, if these homeless people are getting about $300 a month in government benefits, government handouts, you can get much more than that. Relative to their costs, if they sleep in a tent, the cost of their drugs every day, and they eat very little food, right? That is a huge factor, is simply the lower cost and in this sense, the efficacy of the drug and the drug addiction. So there you go. Someone said they gave the YouTube video a thumbs up out of spite. That's the spirit. I rarely repeat myself on the channel, but let's talk through just a couple of parallel examples before moving on. And I admit this is something I've talked about 4 years ago, 6 years ago, quite a long time ago. All right. Um, if you go to a party, let's say you show up late at a house party, so this is at someone's mansion in the Hollywood Hills, and let's say there is a woman passed out on a bed. So you don't know if it's alcohol, drugs, what it is, but she's blacked out at this party. And there's a series of men having sex with her as she lies there on the bed unconscious. She's not even aware that she's having sex with these men. So she's not consenting to it. And therefore, by definition, this is rape, certainly under the American legal code. So this is, by definition, a kind of gang rape, although there's no violence because the victim is unconscious. Imagine you show up at this party late, so you kind of walk into the room and this is already underway, and men are waiting their turn one at a time to have sex with women. And another one of the people at the party turns to you and says, "Oh, are you going to have sex with her also?" And you say, "No, you're morally opposed to rape." And then this person, let's say it's the host of the party turns to you and says, "Oh, but it'll go to waste if you don't." Like, this opportunity to rape someone is just going to go to waste if you don't take advantage of it. Like, the crime has already been committed, whatever the circumstances were. You don't know. Was this woman drugged against her will? Was she given a drug like Rufinol, a so-called date rape drug? Did someone contrive this? Did someone conspire to make this happen against her will? Or did she just have too much to drink, overdose on drugs or something? You don't know exactly what the situation is, but she is being victimized right now. If you don't do it, someone else will. She'll be victimized anyway. The rape is going to happen anyway. Does that change for you? Why don't you guys answer me in the audience if you're not fucking cowards? Why don't you fucking sit there and think about it? Does it change your decision, your mentality in any way? If this is going to, quote unquote, go to waste if you don't join in and participate, if the person is going to be victimized. If you don't eat this cheese, the cows are going to be exploited anyway. The cheese, someone else is going to eat the cheese anyway. Or in some circumstances, the cheese is going to go in the garbage anyway. Don't you want to take advantage of this opportunity to exploit, including rape, to inflict this unspeakable suffering on these cows? Now, there are several different levels on which this is an utterly false, utterly laughable way of thinking about the world, right? Part of my objection to Cosmic Skeptic, as you may have heard me mention in like 10 videos, is not just his utilitarian view of rape, which I see as a glorification of rape, a justification of rape, as a pro-rape philosophy he presents, which for some reason nobody else wants to politically criticize. I also reject the assumption that rape is pleasant for the rapist. Like, I reject even the assumption that this is a pleasure that you will be passing up your opportunity to enjoy if you refuse to participate in the rape, right? In the same sense, I'm actually not even accepting the assumption that eating this piece of pizza, eating this cheese, etc., is something you would enjoy and that you are being deprived, right? Apart from the question of the harm done to cows, harm done to the environment, broader, more nebulous, Now, look, someone in the audience has said, bad analogy. Okay, Charles. Okay, why don't you back that up? Why don't you tell me in exactly what way that's a bad analogy? I think you're a coward. I think you're a moron. I think you don't want to face up to the extent to which it's a terrifyingly accurate analogy. Relatively recently, I read a book about the Vietnam War. It was a very poorly written book. It was in some ways, poorly researched book. It may be the best book on the topic. That's one of the reasons I don't mention this particular book much. It's not a book I encourage others to read, but it was a book that got into quite some detail about American soldiers raping Vietnamese women in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And there were literally situations being described by men who were present. So this really happened, and this is on the record. Sometimes they were talking to journalists, but this is also included courtroom testimony, courts of various kind, by the way, like the military inquiry versus different kinds of officials. Where these guys are describing, there's a woman being raped by a series of American soldiers, and the other soldiers say to the guy, "Aren't you going to get in line? Aren't you going to do it too? It doesn't matter, because at the end of the rape, she's going to be shot in the head. She's going to be executed anyway." So this wasn't just rape, it was rape and murder, rape concluding with murder. And the extent to which this was a regular phenomenon in the American invasion, occupation, military intervention in Vietnam is terrifying. It's terrifying in its implications. I heard testimony, let's get even more recent, in case you think this is just the ancient world. I heard detailed testimony about sex slavery and rape from ISIS, so the so-called Caliphate of the Islamic State, ISIS, a major political event in our times, although it came and went so quickly. It seems like a long time ago in the past now. And there was a woman who was one of these brides of ISIS, and she was describing her moral dilemma. There was a very, very young woman, very young teenager. So I forget if she was 15 years old or something like that, but she was a shockingly young teenager. And her father wanted to, sorry. The woman speaking, her husband wanted to buy and rape this girl as a sex slave. And among his justifications, this is a couple of years ago, but this is very much the current decade even. This is just a few years ago. One of his justifications for doing this was other men had already owned her as a slave and had already raped her. He wasn't her first owner. He wasn't enslaving her anew. And if he didn't do it, somebody else would. And my impression is, it's not like there were thousands of men involved. He was in a unit, a group of ISIS soldiers, Caliphate soldiers. He probably knew the other guys. Like, oh, well, if I don't buy her, this other guy is going to buy her. And this woman said, in justifying her own role in this, the woman giving this testimony is the wife of the ISIS soldier. She felt that this teenage girl would be treated even worse, that she would have a worse life if someone else enslaved her, that at least if her husband bought this girl, she as the wife would be able to feed and clothe and care for and help this girl have a decent shot at life, that she felt she was better off sheltering this girl rather than someone else buying her who may exploit her in a further way. So this particular teenage girl was a child of the Yazidi tribe, Yazidi religion. So if you guys don't know, the Yazidis are a form of monotheism that that Muslim fundamentalists consider equivalent to devil worship. It's not devil worship, but you know what I mean. Whatever. From the Puritan perspective, the Catholic religion is devil worship, but it's considered an illegitimate religion from the Muslim perspective, and so they're completely reckless in enslaving and indeed exterminating these people. And so they were among the victims of the rise of ISIS that were most, okay. These are real situations. Real people find themselves in, and real people struggle to be good. They struggle to figure out which is the lesser of two evils. And that's literally a situation where this person is going to be enslaved no matter what. The question is just, is it going to be enslaved by this man or this one or this one? And where this person is going to be raped no matter what. But the question is, she going to be raped by this one, or this one? And the woman giving this testimony, which she didn't have to give, she could just exercise her right to remain silent. For whatever reason, she felt comfortable. Stay. I mean, I saw it on YouTube. I assume it's also been written about in the New York Times or whatever. It's probably written about. It's a very salacious story, sort of thing the press latches onto. But she included the detail that she was many times literally lying in the bed next to her husband and this teenage girl as he raped her. And she did describe it. Like, she did not give the impression that this teenage girl had a crush on her husband or in any way reciprocated that she said she herself witnessed. She was in the same small room and sometimes lying on the same bed trying to get to sleep as this happened, that she endured it, the up close and personal reality of this. Okay? All right. Okay. Waste. Waste is a complex concept. If you think this thing will go to waste, this pizza, this piece of cheese, this pepperoni, whatever it is, right? If you think it will go to waste if you don't eat it, implicit in that is a judgment, not just about the cheese, not just about the pepperoni, it's a judgment about you. Okay. If you think this rape will go to waste if you don't join in and take your turn, whether it's the rape described at the party, the rape described in a military context in Vietnam, the rape described in a context of slavery in ISIS, the short-lived caliphate, okay? You are telling me something about who you are and what rape means to you. If you think there's something there that will go to waste if you do not enjoy it. Well, guys, it's been 42 minutes. Do you want me to just end the video there? None of you have shit to say to me, huh? No follow-up from the person who thought this was a bad analogy, right? No. Now, look, let me say something. As terrible as ISIS was, so again, ISIS meaning the Islamic Caliphate that came and went, okay? You know what the sad truth is? Probably in terms of carbon emissions, probably in terms of their effect on the ecology of the planet as a whole, ISIS is what you might want to describe as an ecologically sustainable problem. The whole world, I mean, 50% of the world could be occupied by horrible, marauding barbarians who are members of ISIS for 1,000 years. And the polar ice caps wouldn't melt, and the sea levels wouldn't rise, and ocean acidification wouldn't be a problem. I mean, those guys are the original minarchists. They're the original anarcho-primitivists. Look at what the reality of, Afghanistan was before September 11, 2001. Nobody had a cellular phone. It was forbidden to even have anything that played music. You know what I mean? Okay. They were living at an appallingly low level of technology. Probably the most fuel-efficient society that's ever existed. They burned incredibly little gasoline, right? Tremendous levels of human misery, right? Ecologically sustainable, not going to end the world. Again, sorry, I've made more videos talking about my complex views on prostitution, but let's just say I am not one of these left-wingers. I'm not one of these left-wing people who says, oh, sex work is just work. Everything's positive. There's a lot of glorification of prostitution right now on the left. I do not feel that way. I'm just simplifying. I have made videos talking about that. It's a more complex example. Look at the tiny island of Cuba where prostitution is a huge percentage of the economy. I can tell you, I have been to Pattaya, Thailand, where prostitution is a huge percentage of the economy. You can stand there and look at that and say, yeah, this is kind of morally abhorrent. This is kind of disturbing, and we can philosophize about exactly why. We can pin down in terms of political science exactly why. But you know what? The whole world could become a prostitution-ridden hellhole like Pattaya, Thailand, and the polar ice caps wouldn't melt. and the sea level wouldn't rise, and ocean acidification wouldn't be a problem. Let's put it this way. It wouldn't be the end of the world. If men, let's just be gender essentialist, if heterosexual men all over the whole planet behaved the way men in Pattaya, Thailand behave, it would not be the end of the world. And if men all over the planet behaved the way ISIS soldiers behave, which we've already described in this video, which I find completely morally reprehensible, completely abhorrent, I disapprove, I feel it should be illegal. But if men behave that way, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Here's the thing about billions of cows, billions of pigs, billions of sheep being kept in captivity to provide for you this diet. It actually is the end of the world. The consequences are unspeakably tremendous, ecologically, economically, etc. So, of all the evils for you to justify and relativize in this way, the difference between a vegan and a non-vegan diet, right? It might actually have the highest stakes of all. So Lee says, I didn't see the follow-up. Did YouTube not allow the commenters? There's no follow-up. I haven't deleted a single comment. Sometimes there is some that has to be deleted, but shall I sit here in silence? Just, would anyone like to describe? Guys, I don't care if you give the video a thumbs up. I don't care if you share the link. Okay? You are never going to hear this from Earthling Ed. And it doesn't matter if Earthling Ed's book sells 10,000 more copies than my book. It doesn't matter if Earthling Ed's YouTube channel gets 100,000 views for every one view I get. Okay? Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Cosmic Skeptic and Peter Singer go on to be the most influential people in the vegan movement of this century, which is possible. That is not impossible. Okay? They are wrong, and I am right. And it's irrefutable and unassailable because their position is morally incoherent, whereas mine is coherent. Now let's talk about the stakes and consequences in a personal way and in an abstract and symbolic way, briefly. Or if you guys are interested, I can say at greater length. If you guys are interested in this, I can take this in. I'm actually flexible, open to more than one direction here. Why is it morally wrong to go around wearing a t-shirt with a swastika on it, and let's say the t-shirt says Hitler was right? These days, it might be a t-shirt that says Kanye West was right. Might be more likely. What is morally wrong about that? Now we could fill in the blank. We could make it something more specifically that's denying the Holocaust. Why is that immoral or abhorrent? Right? Now, for people like Cosmic Skeptic, I think also for people like Hank Green, this is very hard to answer, actually. You want to think about so-called consequentialism. You want to think about utilitarianism. The t-shirt doesn't hurt anyone. The t-shirt doesn't kill anyone. The t-shirt doesn't even mislead anyone. Like, the t-shirt isn't going to convince someone of revisionist history, right? It's just a slogan and a symbol. What is morally wrong with this? Well, in our times, within, I would say, the last 30 years, what used to be a very fringe view on the left wing has evolved and expanded and metastasized to be a major dominant delusion in the politics and philosophy of our time. What the left wing has been saying with increasing frequency and increasing passion is that speech itself is a form of violence and that this actually harms and hurts people. Right? Now, there are many, many reasons why I think that's a dangerous delusion, right? For one thing, it leads to the end of freedom of speech. Certainly the end of you being able to have a t-shirt with a slogan on it that causes someone else psychological distress or discomfort, right? If freedom of speech is not permitted to our enemies, it's also not permitted to us, right? We have to deal with some implications. But that is a major dominant view of our time that deserves its own YouTube video, what have you, to deal with. Okay. Why would it be morally wrong for me to go around wearing a t-shirt that just promotes and endorses pepperoni and cheese pizza? Now, irony of ironies. Can you name a YouTuber who gets millions of views per month, millions, who wears and promotes and sells t-shirts that glorify and glamorize and promote pepperoni and cheese pizza? Hank Green. Ecologist and science educator Hank Green, who has admitted on camera that a vegan diet is perhaps 5-to-1 better for ecology, perhaps 10-to-1, perhaps more than 10-to-1 better for the world's ecology than a meat-eating diet. I've seen him say this. He had a bunch of perhaps statements in there. I don't know why, but it's like, oh, well, according to the research, eating a vegan diet is maybe like by a ratio of 5-to-1 better for ecology and carbon dioxide and global warming and so on, but maybe 10-to-1, maybe more. It's so he gave a broad range, but it is dramatically better for the world's ecology. The t-shirt doesn't hurt anyone. T-shirt doesn't even convince you to buy pepperoni and cheese pizza, right? The problem is of moral incoherence, right? It's incoherent to wear a t-shirt that promotes slavery, that promotes Nazism, that promotes cheese, pepperoni, right? When was the last time you saw someone wearing a t-shirt that promotes rape culture? What if someone had a t-shirt saying that their father fought in the Vietnam War and engaged in exactly the type of rape I just described to you, and they feel their father did nothing wrong and that they'd be happy to do this themselves? This message with whatever complexity or simplicity on a t-shirt. What if that becomes a popular enough ideology in our culture that it has a symbol just as recognizable as the Nazi swastika, and a whole bunch of guys are going around wearing that t-shirt because that's what they believe. That's the political and philosophical view they want to pound, right? The t-shirt doesn't harm anyone. Speech is not violence. But there is a problem here that's more important than just a question of something being in poor taste or something being offensive, right? There is a question of whether or not we as animals are going to be rational or irrational, whether we are going to be coherent or incoherent. And your ability to participate in a democracy, your ability to make use of freedom of speech, for example, actually really rests on, first and foremost, your ability to rise to that minimum standard of coherence. And more troublingly, our ability as a society of millions or as a small group of 20 people, our ability as a group to do anything political relies on each and every participant being coherent. 20 people in a room, 20 people. Let's say I have a book launch. I'm going to talk about my book, take questions on it. We're going to talk about the book and related things. If there's just one incoherent person in the room, just one, either we have to have security, kick him out, or the whole thing doesn't work. We can't do it. We can't have this discussion with just one incoherent person. And I've been in this position. University lecture. university workshop, what do you want to say? University colloquium, whether it's 20 people or 40 people, and we're all supposed to participate in this kind of democratic way. It's not an interrogation where one person is in charge and one person is silent, or no. Okay. There's just one incoherent person in the room. The whole event is for nothing. The whole event is ruined. I've gone to City Hall. I've been in real political situations. Okay. Again, sometimes there are 5 people in the meeting, sometimes it's 30 people. It's never a huge number of people. Whatever. Let's say sometimes as many as 200 people in a room. Every single one has to rise to this level of coherence. So there is a real reason why at City Hall or at that book club meeting, or whatever you want to say, book launch party, or at all these different kinds of colloquia, if just one person shows up wearing a Nazi swastika on a t-shirt, everyone takes a step back and says, whoa, we probably have to exclude you. Like this whole thing, there's just one, we probably can't tolerate you, right? People talk about the paradox of tolerance, right? This is not going to work at all. And the topic of discussion that day may have nothing to do with Nazism. If one person shows up with the pro-rape t-shirt, right? If you're wearing this, okay. But the biggest moral contradictions of our times, I've covered both of them in this video. Drug addiction and the non-vegan diet, however you want to put it, meat, cheese, etc. These are the biggest. And currently, if you wear a t-shirt promoting pepperoni and cheese pizza, if you wear a t-shirt promoting Prozac, promoting Haldol, promoting prescription drug use, prescription drug addiction, or a t-shirt just saying that you're cool with marijuana, fentanyl, crack cocaine, with the drug culture, the drug life, which I see all the time. People have different ways of symbolizing it, but people do wear t-shirts and wear a whole outfit that expresses proudly that they're part of the drug culture, that they're the kind of person to go to Coachella and get high and use these drugs, whether they're trying to show that they're associated with MDMA or LSD or marijuana or fentanyl. A lot of people wear drug regalia, shall we say, drug culture regalia, a lot, whether that's in hip hop culture or hippie culture. A lot of ways people can show you that they're part of the drug culture. Okay. Right now, we haven't even progressed to the point where that's perceived as incoherent and disqualifying you from having your turn at the microphone, your voice, your seat at the table. And it does. The tragedy is, I don't celebrate at all. The tragedy is that it does. So Thomas Taine, I assume that's how your name's pronounced? Thomas Taine, you say, quote, the difference you can make doesn't matter, close quote. That's where you're wrong. The difference you can't make is what doesn't matter. You imbecile. The difference you can make matters more than everything else in your life. Everything. When you look back at the life of Benjamin Franklin, it's very difficult to exaggerate what a difference he's made in the history of the world. It's very difficult. Benjamin Franklin didn't just change the history of the United States, the history of Canada, the history of England, all of Europe. I mean, and someone could publish a book about how much influence he had in China. I'm not kidding you. How much influence he had in Japan. Ben Franklin's where it traveled. Okay. But obviously places like Australia. Benjamin Franklin influenced the whole history of the world. And I happen to know for a fact he put a lot of time and energy into his sex life. I think there's one thing I had in common with Ben Franklin. It's that we were both cursed with a very high sex drive. I think I'm coping with it better than he did, frankly. Ben Franklin put a lot of time and energy into his love life, into his sex life, into love affairs, and he did sleep with prostitutes. There are different periods of time where it's kind of been captured for history. Obviously, he tried to keep it concealed, and obviously, he was a complete hypocrite about it. In his own writing, he doesn't. What he says about his own sexuality. So interesting guy. He's got contradictions. When you just look back and ask yourself, what is it that matters about the life of Ben Franklin? It is precisely the difference he could make. Why do I say that? Some of you, English is not your first language. I did not say the difference he did make. We can also talk about, hypothetically, the difference he could have made. Ben Franklin described himself as a vegetarian. He wasn't. He wasn't really. We've made a video about that in the past, but he called himself a vegetarian. He talked about vegetarianism. He talked about the morality of being a vegetarian. I think it's fair to say he had times of his life in which he cared about vegetarianism. It came and went for him. It wasn't a consistent passion. Okay, it is very easy to say that is a difference he could have made. He could have just talked more about it, cared about it. He could have really been remembered in history as the first major advocate for vegetarianism or veganism. That is a difference he could have made. Okay. Slavery. I probably don't need to repeat myself. Ben Franklin was in an incredibly powerful position to take a position. Let's just say, let's not even narrow it down to slavery. He could have argued for the intellectual equality of Black people, that Black people are not born monkeys or like beasts of burden or oxen. He could have, and he didn't. That's a difference he could have made at any stage of his career, but obviously, especially in the later stage of his career, we already knew how famous and revered and influential he was. The status of women. It could have changed the whole world forever. Even if he lost the debate, if he had stood up and said clearly in the debates about the American Constitution, even though women may be physically weaker than men, even though women may have all kinds of disadvantages compared to men, fundamentally, women should have the right to vote. They should have the right to participate in discussions about politics, the same way that women have the right at that time to write newspaper articles about politics. There were some. They're not a lot, but there were some women, participating in politics in that sense, writing a newspaper article or a letter to the newspaper. That it is fundamentally absurd and immoral to exclude women from politics. There's the difference he did make. And there's actually a really interesting, broader category of the difference he could have made. I think I've read enough of Ben Franklin that on any one of those issues, if you could travel back in time and have a dialogue with him, I think you would have quite a nuanced discussion. I don't think he was a thoughtless jackass on those issues. And we know, partly because we know who his friends were, and we know to some extent what they talk about from letters they wrote to each other. He discussed all those issues. He was conversant with those issues. He was aware of their significance. Probably the single biggest blind spot for him would have been indigenous people, American Indians, First Nations, whatever you say, the genocide and war and what should happen. Probably that would have been the hardest thing to get him to talk about or reflect on. But he was a free thinker. Now, you know what? I do feel morally superior to Ben Franklin, and I'll let you know I have never paid a prostitute to have sex with me. Life is long. I assume I never will, but if my circumstances change, I'll come on YouTube and tell you guys about it. I assume I'm never going to, and I never have. And I look at Ben Franklin and I think, isn't this a bit contemptuous? What you did with your sex life? But what really matters is the difference you can make. Now, deep cuts, I'm going to allude back to a video I made many years ago. Some of you will remember it. I once had a debate with another YouTuber about the legalization and decriminalization of drugs, whether or not marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, whether these things should be decriminalized, whether you should have a so-called harm reduction approach, or whether you should have the type of approach Japan has, Singapore has, broadly speaking, culturally, Chinese places have, Taiwan, communist China, of actually trying to eliminate this kind of drug addiction and recreational drug use. So this was the debate. And the person I was debating with, the person I was disagreeing with, who was vegan at the time, I don't know if she is anymore. I suspect she's ex-vegan. She identified as vegan at the time, whether or not she really was. She argued very passionately that using these drugs, even cocaine, even heroin, even fentanyl, even methamphetamine, that this should be a civil right everyone can enjoy as an adult making their own decisions in life. And I said, okay, everyone. The police officer in your neighborhood, can you accept the police officer being a cocaine addict? And she immediately changes her whole tune and is horrified and says, no, she can't accept the police officer. The babysitter you hire to take care of your kids, can you accept them being a cocaine addict? No. Parents raising their own child. You think it's a problem that parents neglect their own child because they're a cocaine addict, they're a methamphetamine addict, any of these other drugs? All of a sudden, she's getting really uncomfortable. And what I said to her very passionately was, don't you realize there aren't two classes of human beings? One class who make decisions that matter, and another class who are so contemptible that their responsibilities are of no significance at all. Each of us, in our own way, is at least as important as a police officer. Each of us, in our own way, is as important as a parent raising a child. There are people who depend on you. Not all of us are going to influence the whole world in the dramatic fashion that, Benjamin Franklin did. But yes, the difference you can make does matter. And I don't know how old you are. I don't know your experience life. I am saying to you, it matters more than you can know. It matters more than you specifically know. Part of nihilism, in my opinion, is being self-critical, is arguing against your own position. I have one brother, a half-brother, who is so mentally disabled that he is not able to speak in any language. And it's not genetic. He's mentally disabled because his mother attempted suicide during the pregnancy. His mother is not my mother, different woman. So that's someone who is so severely mentally disabled that his whole life he is just taken care of by nurses and assistants and so on. Okay. Yes, I can argue against them. There are some people who are so mentally disabled, they don't take responsibility for anything. They don't make any decisions that matter. Aside from what he eats and the clothes he wears, he makes almost no decisions. And he literally can't even cook his own food. He can't put on his own clothes. Someone else dresses him. I think you can imagine the nurse or the assistant comes in and says, oh, what do you want to wear today? And they physically dress him and they clean him and they feed him, right? And he never gets better. Yeah, there are some people. Okay. Do you have more in common with my mentally disabled half-brother, or do you have more in common with a police officer? Do you have more in common with a parent? Do you have more in common with Benjamin Franklin? Just being real with you, you have more in common with Benjamin Franklin than you think you do. All right. If you guys have anything intelligent to say, now it's time to say it. So this is a real interesting conflict that took place between two people in the crowd. I shout out to ATL Richard. I assume he's Richard from Atlanta. If ATL means Atlantis, let me know. Richard from Atlantis. So someone who seems to be a complete imbecile named Emily says, so Emily Henderson says, quote, you advocate against factory farming, ... As for the shirt, everything starts with an idea, ... We don't stop speech, we counter it with more speech. Not sure how veganism is, quote, broken, close quote, based on this content. Now, I assume this person only heard a couple minutes. It's been admittedly, it's been over 1 hour now. But the response from Richard in Atlantis, is interesting. Richard says back at Emily Henderson, that argument is an appeal by the majority. No way a few vegans are going to outscream thousands of carnist people. Emily Henderson then says back, quote, nothing coherent in this stream thus far. Ew, bye. So she was offended. Just like we don't know if that person was vegan or not. I would assume this person was not vegan. I don't know if they're uncertain about what my position is on factory farming or something. They probably, well, by the way, I'm happy to have non-vegan people come and hear this, but that was someone who evidently couldn't handle it. So that response from Richard is interesting. Two things briefly, again, unless someone is interested and wants to go further with this. One of the most powerful delusions of our time is that problems will be solved by, quote unquote, the free market of ideas. Okay. The free market of ideas will never abolish circumcision. Never. Neither male circumcision nor female circumcision. What people are misled by, and I do talk about this in my book, Future of an Illusion. Again, it costs $1. If you get it in the other format, if you get it on paper, it costs $4, but whatever. If a brand new cell phone comes out and it really is better than every other cellular phone on the market, the free marketplace of ideas, on the one hand, this cell phone makes the other cell phones obsolete. But of course, the other cell phone companies imitate the new, better cell phone. That is an example of how the free marketplace of ideas works. And we're all familiar with it. And I will point out to you, in Muslim societies, they all use, a mainstream Muslim society like Malaysia, Indonesia, they all use the same cell phones that are used in Japan or in California. Not the Taliban, as you know, not all Muslim societies. You can have the most repressive authoritarian society imaginable, where in this sense, the free market of ideas fosters progress of a certain kind, right? It is not true that free speech and this kind of open competition in the marketplace of ideas will ever lead to the abolition of circumcision. And I mean this across all religions, but it's the largest number of people being circumcised globally. It's never going to happen that way. That is only going to come about through a political decision to enforce the will of one group of people upon another. Think about the future of Iran. The only way circumcision can be abolished in Iran is going to be some kind of change in the government, and where you have a government that's really willing to step out and do this. Now, I can think of a real world historical comparison here. This comes quite close to abolishing drug addiction too. In China, they had a practice that went back many centuries of foot binding. And this is taking a woman's foot when she's still a child and breaking the bones in her foot. It's incredibly brutal. I almost want to tell you, don't Google it. Don't look up images. It's an unspeakably brutal practice. But the woman's foot would be broken and the flesh folded over in half and it would be wrapped up. That's why it's called foot binding, so that it could never heal. And the woman would be disabled for her whole life. Her ability to walk or carry heavy objects, or ability to do something like buy groceries and carry things would be really impaired for the rest of her life. But she'd be able to fit her foot into a much smaller shoe. It gave the illusion of her having tiny feet. And this kind of crippling of women was incredibly widespread. And you might think, oh, well, enlightened individuals can just make the choice not to do this. There were examples recorded for history. Again, I've read this in a book. I don't know how many examples are this, but there are examples from things like autobiographies and interviews where women said that, like, they as a mother decided not to do this to their own daughter because they thought it was so terrible. And then their daughter complained to them bitterly that they couldn't get a husband because men only wanted to marry women who had broken feet. I think you can imagine more easily a society in which pierced ears have this kind of, so, well, men only want to marry a woman who can wear earrings. I mean, our culture is not like that. That's easy to imagine. Well, this is much more extreme, right? Okay, how about female genital mutilation? How about female circumcision? And you have a society where men only want to marry a woman who's undergone this terrible procedure that cuts out part of the vagina. How about male circumcision? You have a society where women only want to marry a man who's circumcised. And trust me, have you heard of Judaism and Islam also? These are large religions with this real pressure. And where indeed, literally, the child could complain to the parent, why didn't you do this to me? Now I'm at a disadvantage. No one will marry me. And people even revile me and insult me and call me a barbarian because I don't have this mark of civilization on my body. Who is to be a barbarian and who is not? This is only going to be changed, right? Through political coercion. Coercion, I would prefer, if it's in a democratic society, foot binding, the breaking and binding of women's feet in China. This was abolished through completely non-democratic means. And I'm the world's harshest critic of Mao Zedong. I'm the world's harshest critic of Chinese communism. But yes, I think you can imagine the Communist Party of China had no problem with the brutality involved in eliminating the culture and custom and history of foot binding. They also had no problem with the brutality required in eliminating heroin addiction. I would mention it is related and it is in some ways parallel. So, Paul, do you want to talk to me? Paul Myers, I assume you're still here. Paul Myers says veganism isn't a movement. Okay. Paul, if you take just two examples, okay, we could say three examples. You can take the political foundation that's created by, so what does he call his channel? Dr. Greger. What's his channel called again? Right. So the Nutrition Facts organization set up by Dr. Greger that has a budget of more than $1 million a year. Direct Action Everywhere, to my knowledge, they're still above $1 million a year total donations. We can add in also People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. I've made videos in the past talking about their budget, much, much more than $1 million a year. There is also a vegan institution in Europe that's associated with Tobias Leonhardt. Exactly what I can't say he's the leader, but he's kind of the public face doing interviews for this organization. Well over $1 million a year. I can go on. There are many. Gary Yourofsky, I believe, at his peak. I mean, probably not anymore. He was getting a large amount of money. We could go through how much money has been given to how many institutions, organizations, so on and so forth. It's very difficult to look at this multi-million-dollar conspiracy and say that it's not a movement. Now, it's very easy to look at it and say that it's a really bad movement. It's a really bad use of your money. It's a waste. It's a failure. I am the harshest critic of the vegan movement. I'm certainly the harshest critic from within the vegan movement. But I think it's undeniable that what you're looking at, that this conglomeration of multi-million-dollar institutions and demagogues. When you look at the demagoguery involved, that it is a movement. Now, by contrast, if you talk about the opposition to global warming, is that a movement? Is it one movement? People who are interested in habitat conservation and endangered species, are they really the same movement as people who are interested in getting rid of coal-fired power plants? Ecology is actually quite difficult to analyze in the same way as one movement. as one pie chart that can then be divided into millions of dollars being spent on different things. There are very deep rifts within what can casually be called or grouped together as ecology. And the veganism really is one movement. It's a terrible movement. It's a failure. It's unbelievably. It's impossible to be optimistic about it. But yes, we are discussing and debating here, the future of a movement. And as I say, I think even in the title of this video, it is a political movement that is broken. Okay. I began this video with the image of old Noam Chomsky arguing that the simplest way to solve the problem is to change human nature itself. And none of you have argued on Noam's behalf here. Oh, well, what's the simplest way to solve global warming? Right? My main warning is that thinking in terms of things that are impossible can lead you to fail to understand and to fail to appreciate the importance of the things that are possible. And maybe I'm only making this point now and I failed to make it earlier in the video, but hey, we're not running out of fresh material. This focus on things that are impossible and the type of abstract and hypothetical reasoning that goes along with it, it leads us to ignore what the matters of principle truly are that we're committed to. So I said before, this view I've attributed to Cosmic Skeptic and Hank Green and several others, where they say, oh, well, if it's going to go to waste anyway, they'll do it. And I challenge them saying, oh, so your general statement of principle, do you actually believe, do you actually actually believe that you actually preach that an evil act, whether it be slavery, rape, or eating cheese, that an evil act is not evil if by not committing the evil act, the opportunity to commit the evil act or to enjoy the evil act would be lost, would be wasted. I mean, again, when it's stated that plainly, when it's stated as a matter of principle, no one could possibly defend this. Well, again, we could use murder, we could use revenge, we could use all kinds of things. But something that we both agree is an evil act, something you should at least minimize, if not have zero of in your life, but simply by framing it in terms of waste, in terms of a lost opportunity, does that change, our moral and philosophical and political reasoning, right? So again, I don't think I have to argue that point further. What I have to say further is this: by trading in things that are impossible, by thinking in terms of things that are unattainable, we lead ourselves away from the clarity, perhaps the uncomfortable clarity of facing up to what those matters of principle truly are. So another thing you will hear back as an excuse for people not being vegan is they will say back that what really matters is people taking fewer voyages by airplane. Now, what a claim. We're not going to digress into the quantitative aspects involved there. I will ask you, someone could Google this right now. What percentage of human beings take more than 10 airplane journeys a year? There's a very small percentage of people take 10 airplane journeys a year. What percentage of people eat meat, cheese, and eggs at least once a day? Most people eat it 3 times a day, 5 times a day, reading this kind of stuff constantly. But, so the scale of the problem, the ecological impact, even though airplanes do matter, I'm not dismissing that. Okay. What percentage of people take flights 10 times in a year? Is the principle you're actually preaching, you're actually promoting, that in a perfect world, nobody should travel by airplane? Is it that the world would be a better place if nobody ever took a flight, if as few people as possible took a flight? Again, I'm just going through this very rapidly. In theory, you could be talking to someone who's an anarcho-primitivist. You could be talking to someone who's an actual anti-technology nutcase who really believes the world would be a better place if nobody had access to airplanes, if nobody ever had the right to take an airplane. But setting aside this type of fringe political ideology, probably your view is instead, if you are able to take on this kind of clarity and talk about what's possible and think in terms of what's possible. Well, no, I guess the reality is there's just a small number of people who are so wealthy and so idle that they're taking more than 10 flights a year. And that could be reduced if we encourage them, whether through a law or through a kind of tax, right? It could be the first flight you take in a year, there's a 1% tax on. The second flight you take in the year is a 2% tax, and then a 4% tax. Or, it could just be, hey, if you take 10 flights, that's okay. But when you take the 11th flight, there's a 100% tax. We step it up that way. You got to watch yourself. Once you get into 11, the price doubles. 100% tax means the price doubles, to discourage you from doing more than 10 flights. Now, a small number of people, like business executives, will say, hey, I need to take more than 10 flights a year. If you force me to stop at 10 flights a year, that just means I have to have my assistant. I have to have someone else in my company take the flight to go to that meeting because I got to do it. It's necessary, right? There are some people for whom it's not flexible, right? So the argument you are actually making probably is that the world would be a better place if a tiny number of people for whom this is flexible, for whom they have the option of vacationing a bus journey away as opposed to an airplane journey away, if they made this decision about their vacations, and then you can run the numbers and you can see what the actual ecological significance of that is, compared to the impossible to exaggerate significance of millions of people keeping millions of animals in captivity. And again, the runoff going into the rivers, all of those animals in captivity are producing their own sewage, but it doesn't go into a sewage system. It goes into rivers and oceans. The unspeakable ecological consequences of providing meat at such a cheap price also to millions of people to eat multiple times per day. You have to discipline yourself to think in terms of what is possible and not in terms of what is ideal, in terms of what is optimal. There is a tragic sense, there is a childish sense in which Noam Chomsky is right, in which the best way to solve the drug addiction problem is just to, cure the hearts, the souls, the minds of all humanity so that nobody feels they need to use cocaine. Nobody desires this stuff. Nobody desires methamphetamine. No, yes, if only we could change human nature. And that's something a child could believe, right? I mean, I've spoken to some very childish adults who think that way too, right? But it's only when we admit to ourselves that that's impossible that we direct our attention instead toward what's possible. And my claim, insinuated throughout this whole video and stated bluntly now, is that vegan politics and the vegan movement is fundamentally misguided. It's fundamentally broken because for decades we have been training ourselves, we have been hypnotizing ourselves with this kind of intoxicating idealistic belief that what we're going to do is change human nature. And the whole conception of vegan activism, the whole conception of what we do now with our lives, yours and mine, in the next 5 years, that changes. It changes in ways both shallow and profound when you begin by admitting to yourself what is possible and what is impossible, in the same sense that you're going to shift your whole strategy for how to cope with, how to ultimately solve the problem of mass drug addiction in the United States of America. The first step, not the last step, the first step in your reasoning has to be admitting to yourself the distinction between what is possible and what is impossible.